Every home coffee roaster has these two tools to help them have a successful roast. So stick around and let's talk about it. All right, thank you so much for joining me today and welcome to the Virtual Coffee Lab. Today we're going to be talking about two tools that every home coffee roaster has. Doesn't cost them a penny, and you can use them right now on your next roast. What I'm talking about is color and smell. So sight and smell. We're going to be talking about each of the three coffee phases and how you are going to apply your two tools, which is sight and smell, or monitoring the color of the beans and smelling what is happening, to give you more information about the roast so that you can have a successful roast. Before I do that though, first I want to thank you guys for watching this video. There are quite a few of you who are new to this channel. Thank you to all those who have subscribed. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. That helps me out. One more thing, I'm planning on putting up a poll for my channel. It'll be sent out to the subscribers, let them know that there's a poll. But if you could, check it out. It's on the community tab. You'll see it there. And what I'm asking for is, what are you using to roast your coffee? What type of device are you using? I'll have the options there. If you could select one that best fits what you're using to roast your coffee, that would be really helpful for me, because it kind of helps me to kind of think about and craft specific content for everyone, but will kind of hone in on some of your specific roasters. I'd really appreciate that. I do have some intentions to do more roasting with some different devices, more on that in a future video. And so for now, let's get to the color and smell, the two tools, the sight and the smell, that we can use to help us have a successful roast. And like I mentioned, I'm going to break this down into the three phases of coffee. So for those that aren't familiar with what I'm talking about, if you're newer to this channel, check out the link to a playlist in the upper corner. You'll see that has all of my cornerstone videos that include the different phases of coffee roasting. And that way it'll help you organize and plan your roast during each of these phases. It really helps make sense of all of this, and it really is an effective way to roast. So first is the drying phase. This is the first phase of the roast where heat is being applied to your coffee beans and they change from a green color to a yellow color. This is the drying phase that we've identified. And so obviously, sight is you're watching the beans, and there's several things that are going to happen to the beans during this phase. This phase isn't necessarily a phase that's going to craft flavor in your coffee, but it can, as I've mentioned in why the dry phase is so important, which is in that playlist. This phase will set you up for success for the rest of the roast. But as we watch the color and watch the size of the beans, we'll notice we go from an olive colored or a darker colored green, or if it's a washed coffee. If it's a dry process coffee, it may have a little bit of a hue, like a red tinge to it, or an orange tinge to it, and that's totally normal. If you have a washed process coffee that has any sort of yellow or red tinting to it, that's probably something went wrong during the processing of that coffee, and you probably wouldn't want to use that coffee. If you've got experience with that, if you've seen that happen or you've noticed anything like that, I would love to hear your comments. Share those in the comments area below. So as we're roasting during the dry phase, heat is being applied to these beans and it's beginning to penetrate the bean. Several things are happening. One is moisture is starting to retreat from the bean and also towards the center of the bean to protect the embryo of the seed itself. We want to continue to apply heat, but what's going to happen is we're going to start to smell and we're going to start to see some changes. We're going to see the color change. The color will begin to pale. a couple minutes into the roast. Go from a dark green to a brighter green or a pale green. This is the very, very early signs of color change as we aim towards our transition to a yellow color, which signifies, full yellow signifies, again, the end of the dry phase. We'll notice things in smell like hay, and that's an early type of an odor, aroma that you will smell as the roast begins. As then, as it moves on, you will start to smell a grassy smell. And then ultimately, you'll start to smell a little bit of a yeasty, doughy kind of a smell as you get closer towards the end of the dry phase. The size of the bean is going to change. The bean will start to swell in size. In one of my videos, we were talking about how to master the manual mode of a BeMore, and one of my roasting friends, Lou, had made the observation as the beans tumble, they tumble differently. So if you have a way to watch the beans and visually see them during the roast, then he mentioned that they almost tumbled like footballs in his BeMore cage as the roast was turning. And by the way, just a helpful little tip that Lou did, that's kind of a cool tip, is he changed the light bulb in his BeMore to go from a incandescent yellow kind of tinged light to a brighter white light, and that helps him to watch the color change better. So we want to watch our color change, and we want to smell this coffee. And why do we want to do that during the dry phase? Why do we even need to bother? We did need to bother for a few reasons. We need to pay attention to our roast, and we need to pay attention to our roast progression to make sure that everything's moving along fine. And we need to correlate that to the time that's being spent in the dry phase. If you find yourself seeing these colors change from green to yellow in a matter of a minute or two, that's too fast. You need to slow your roast down. You need to turn your heat down if possible. That's something that we're going to be talking about in a future video. But every home roaster, if there's one goal that you want to be able to have, that is to be able to control your heat. You need to be able to control your heat. So if you're using just a hot air popcorn popper, that's probably the most challenging device to roast coffee with, because you have very little ability to control that temperature unless you do some kind of crazy things, either modify the device electronically, or you will have to find ways to introduce a little bit of cooler air into the chamber while it's in this dry phase, just so that this coffee won't roast too quickly. You want to roast it slower, and what I mean by slower is you want maybe 4 or 5 minutes in your dry phase, or a little bit longer than that, just because you want the heat to penetrate evenly and slowly. You don't want roasting defects, and you don't want underdeveloped coffee. By flying through your roast too quick, you're not going to be able to get that heat to penetrate all the way through to the center of the seed, and you have an uneven roast or underdeveloped coffee. If you go too fast, you'll burn the outside and you won't have roasted the inside. That's the bottom line. All right, so as we're watching these colors change, we want to pay very close attention at the dry phase so that we can know exactly when we have ended the dry phase, and when we begin this next phase, which is called the browning phase, or this middle phase of coffee roasting. Before we get into the middle phase, I want to talk about this transition. I've got some videos that talk about the transition from dry to the browning phase. I think the browning phase is how to roast sweet and flavorful coffee. That is in the playlist that's up there, and you'll want to watch that because it'll talk about heat application and how you want to start now to slow your roast down. We've been building up heat during this dry phase. We've been smelling all these things. We know that the coffee is starting to transform, that the chemical reactions of the coffee are starting to take place, which will formulate and develop our different flavor profiles. And so we want to be careful to have the right amount of time applied towards that middle phase. But This transition point's important from yellow to into yellow, from green into yellow, because we want to prepare ourselves and the roaster to transition to this new browning phase and our goals for the browning phase with times and temperatures. So by knowing how your beans are progressing, by watching the size of the beans and by smelling and monitoring the color of the beans, you're going to know exactly when dry end takes place. And that's huge. That's huge because you will be able to chart your roasts better by knowing how long your dry phase would normally take. So pay attention and make notes and document your roasts. And then you'll know that everything's working well, and you'll have a great opportunity to start to begin to notice some wonderful smells and color change that takes place during this browning phase. So let's talk about that. We have reached the dry end, this yellow color we're looking for, and sometimes it's difficult to identify that. And so we want to make sure that there's no green left in the bean, that it is full yellow, and that is when the beginning of the browning phase begins. We will start to smell, from a yeasty, doughy smell, we will start to smell some sweetness, and we will start to smell some even some baked goods. So imagine, I think the best way to describe it, I was roasting the other night and I was smelling kind of like a pie crust. So we go from a doughy smell with yeast to a baked dough that has a little bit of sweetness in it. That's what you're going to start smelling. You'll notice that the yellow has gone full yellow. Chaff is starting to come off of the bean, and this is the sight portion of what's happening, and the color portion of what's happening during the browning phase. The roast, as it progresses, the coffee will become darker in brown. It'll go to a cinnamon color during the browning phase, and you'll start to smell more sweetness. You could possibly start to smell, if it's a fruity coffee, some sort of fruits. So you may start to smell, if I stick with this pie example, a berry pie or an apple pie. With some of the smells you'll begin to smell. You'll also start to notice some spice or some cinnamon type aromas. And depending upon the coffee you have, you may start to notice even things like, it might be a little early, but a little bit of earthy, tobacco-y kind of smells. But most of the smelling is going to be more towards the sweet on this side, as we are caramelizing, as the natural sugars in the bean begin to develop, and we are caramelizing these beans, and the Maillard reaction is taking place, and the acidity starts to give off aromas of different types of fruit. That's a wonderful thing, but we want to be smelling these things for several reasons during the brown phase. One is it's going to tell us how fast we're moving through our middle phase. Two, it's going to give you an idea potentially of the potential for the beans, what you could potentially get out of these beans as you roast them. And it will help you as that fruity smell or aroma changes from, I used in another video, I used the example of a citrus. You might smell an orange, and then as you go further along in this browning phase, with your heat application, you will start to smell that bright orange take place and change to like maybe a tangerine, or I think it was bergamot was the other, the darker side of the orange that I was referring to. And all of this is taking place during this middle phase, and we're watching the beans to make sure that we see chaff coming off. We see the color changing. We're watching the times of the roast. And all of these are visual confirmations and visual cues for us on how to move forward in the roast. Now, by the time we get to first crack or almost first crack, it's going to be very difficult. We're pretty much committed to the roast. It is what it is. If you're moving too fast through the roast, you're going to have a big challenge to try to slow it down, and it's almost going to be too late during this middle phase where these flavors are developed. Again, that video that I mentioned about how to roast sweet and flavorful coffee talks about the length of time and the different possibilities that take place during this browning phase. But you will start to see your beans continue to swell. You'll start to see them continue to get darker, and we will get to the point where this heat has now been penetrating further and further into the bean until the moisture is so much pressure is building up in this bean that it snaps and it cracks, and that is first crack, and that is the end of the browning phase. We will start to smell more aromas. There's smoke that will start to develop during this development phase, the third phase in coffee roasting. And we are going to want to pay very close attention not only to our sight, the color of the beans, that's going to tell us a lot, but we also want to pay very close attention to smell. Continually smell the coffee after first crack. Every 15 seconds, every 20 seconds, smell the coffee, and you'll start to smell these changes. Some of these fruity aromas that you had originally, that smell is going to change. I was watching a video where somebody was roasting, and it's like, well, there's the fruit. And then the fruit went away, and then there was another aroma that came out. So there's all kinds of really interesting things that take place during this development phase, and you're going to want to definitely smell your coffee and watch what's happening. How far into first crack you want to drop your beans is up to you. You may have a temperature that you drop your beans at automatically. You may have a percentage of this development time that you monitor, and that might be your visual cue. And so the best thing that you can do is smell your coffee and monitor what is going on. If you look at these different pictures that I'm showing you, you're going to see the color change is pretty obvious. And most of you, if you've roasted this coffee more than once or twice, you're going to know whether this coffee is getting darker or can stay in the roaster a little bit longer based on color. Color is a really nice clue to help you know how far along in the roast, but it's not the answer to it's not the do-all be-all. You should be smelling the coffee as well. How much of your development you want to roast, how far you want to go into that roast, and balance your cup, reduce the acidity, all of those things are going to start to come out. You'll take that sweet, caramely, buttery smell maybe that you have in a Guatemalan, and the further you go into that roast, you'll notice that caramely smell will start to turn to a more of a molasses or a darker smell. Pay attention to the smells so you know when to drop the coffee. And then lastly, once you do drop the coffee, this is the cool down. You're not really going to be able to smell the coffee too much if you've got a fan or something that's sucking air, but you'll be able to visually see what's happened with the beans just to kind of confirm, yeah, this is exactly what I was hoping for, or wow, this looks a little dark or looks a little light. Make those notes, because sometimes it's little nuances like that you notice that you'll forget as you eventually taste the coffee. All right, so that is really important. Color and smell are very important. Watching the physical change of the beans is very important. I've noticed things like during the dry phase, and I forgot to mention this, where I'll actually see steam. When I pull the trier out and look at the beans, I'll see some steam coming off the beans. So there's a lot of different visual cues. If you've got something I didn't mention, leave that in the comments. I'd love to read about that. I'm learning just like you are, and so I would love to hear something that I haven't mentioned that you've noticed and that I can learn from. So I really appreciate you guys watching this video. I've got some fun stuff that's going to be coming up in some future videos. I'm going to give you a little teaser here. I actually have a new roaster on order that I'm going to be talking about, and I'm going to be showing you and roasting with in the next couple of weeks. I hope that's my goal. And so I'm going to share that with you in a future video. So thank you so much for joining me today. Again, if you like what you've heard, hit the like button, subscribe to my channel, and I hope you guys have a great week roasting. Take care.